The soul of man can be separated into two. The much more appropriate side, the much more streamlined and side devoted to good and right and virtue, as represented by the silent and MGM postcode sanitized versions. And the other side, the so-called bad side, the side that revels in darkness and perversion and sex and mayhem and murder, the PreCode side. These are the two sides of film production in man. I propose that they can be separated and analyzed, each distinctly as their own individual case of the same tale. Which you prefer is, of course, up to you, but it is the human nature to prefer the majestic power, the call of the PreCode. Free! Hello and welcome back to this Down for the Idealistic Crusade. Of course, I'm talking about the 1931 Rouben Mamoulian directed PreCode masterpiece version of the classic story Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This is, without question, the most famous and the best film adaptation of the classic Robert Louis Stevenson original novella. It is the version that really remains the most timeless and the most striking, even though, like the 1920 silent version with John Barrymore, it is very much deriving elements of the original stage play. So this becoming the sort of popular, conscious, de facto standard version of Jekyll and Hyde very much altered the popular conception of the story and the whole notion of Jekyll and Hyde also featuring a love interest and featuring much more of a sexual undercurrent and things. All of this would also carry over into MGM's 1941 remake, which is directly tied to this film because it was one of MGM's remakes of a previous film that they then purchased the rights to and then tried to suppress, if not entirely destroy. So much like the situation with the British original film adaptation of Gaslight, MGM bought up this version of Jekyll and Hyde, the Paramount 1931 version, and suppressed it to the point where it was unavailable for many years. And then when it came back, it was only available in the post-production code censored version that they had done for reissue. So getting the film in its entire PreCode original release version was definitely a difficult thing to do back in the early days of home video and much earlier on in the photochemical era of film restoration. So we didn't really get the film back to at least something close to, if not entirely, its original release version until really the late 1980s, and then that surfaced on home video in the late 80s and early 90s on VHS and Laserdisc, which I have behind me here. It then transitioned over to the double feature DVD, which is how it was stuck for some time, and then this eventually went out of print, so it was a bit difficult to get a hold of. But now Warner Archive has completed an absolutely breathtaking restoration, which really, I think, achieves miracles with this film, especially considering the really terrible shape the elements had been in, and also trying to restore that originally cut PreCode footage that was removed from the version that basically became the new sort of base element for the film, because that's what primarily survived. So any film from the PreCode era that had censorship with a post-code reissue and then trying to put that footage back, if you find it much later on, is always a difficult thing to do in order to match the elements, and it just adds a lot more work and research and time and effort has to be spent more on films like that other than a typical 1930s film. But this film is extraordinarily special for if when you try to describe PreCode films, this is one of the first films that come up, and this is one of the key examples you could show to somebody who's never seen a PreCode film before, because most PreCode films have all kinds of fantastic elements that are, were some of the first things to go when the code was strictly enforced in 1934. All of the PreCode fun that you get in films of this era of the early talkies that are usually the things you show to people to really knock their socks off when they all say all the dreaded words, old movies are boring, I don't like black and white, and all that nonsense. You show them a PreCode film to shatter those terrible assumptions. But this film doesn't just have PreCode elements galore. It doesn't just define PreCode Hollywood. this film revels in being a pre-code film, and that is perfectly in tune with Jekyll reveling in and becoming Edward Hyde, and being able to experience and really unleash all of his internal base natures, the baser natures of man, which is really the core of Stevenson's original novella and part of what makes it so horrifying. But the whole film revels in being able to do this, and being made at Paramount, it was going to be allowed to be a bit artier in terms of some of the cinematic flourishes and touches, and it had a bit more of a lavish budget than what you had with the other two major horror films in 1931, which is really the explosion of the golden age of horror films in the sound era, because in 1931 you had three giant heavy hitters come out of the gate and really blow the genre doors open. Of course, Universal made Dracula and then Frankenstein, which shattered box office records and got the ball rolling, but it was still at Universal, and they were still in the middle of the Great Depression, so the budgets were not as lavish as they had wished to be, and they had to base their films around the stage plays instead of the much more expansive original novels those properties were based on. Well, Paramount comes along towards the end of the year with this adaptation of Jekyll and Hyde, and much like the Universal films, they are basing it much on the stage play, which had sort of taken precedence over Stevenson's original novel. But this film sort of forms the third of what is referred to as the big three of classic horror films of 1931 that were all phenomenal box office and critical successes. And these three films, one after the other almost, this is what solidified the horror genre forever, and really opened the floodgates for the studios to start cranking out horror films, and thus started the golden age of horror films. And quite frequently, this film gets overlooked a little bit. It doesn't get grouped in with Dracula and Frankenstein as it should, because it was all three in the same year that really got the ball rolling, and again opened the floodgates for the golden age of horror films. So this film is unbelievably important. But that would be enough for its preservation and historical significance. But the fact that it still remains the most effective film adaptation of Stevenson's story is remarkable, because the film is filled with all kinds of flourishes, and again, the fact that it was made at Paramount, it had a bit more of a lavish budget. It does have that sort of, for lack of a better term, that sort of artier Paramount flavor, that sort of idea you think of when you think Paramount back when studios had an actual house style. Paramount was the artier, much more European of the major studios. This is where Lubitsch was making films, for example. So it makes sense that if they did Jekyll and Hyde, it was going to be a bit more lavish and much more, a bit more highbrow in terms of how it was going to play out versus, say, Universal making horror films. But the real masterstroke was Rouben Mamoulian being selected to direct this. Mamoulian is a name that should be well known and respected, and unfortunately he is not as often discussed as he should be. This is one of his crowning achievements, because he manages to not just direct this film, but inject this incredible energy, this sense of trying to break through cinematic barriers, but also to really drive the energy of the story to make the film represent cinematically what the Jekyll character is going through, and then the sort of perverse pleasure and the unleashing of bestial natures in becoming Hyde, and how it becomes a bit of an addiction, and how it's breaking through the barriers imposed by Victorian society. So it's also societal criticism, which is also part of Stevenson's original story idea. It's interesting that Mamoulian makes the whole film tie into all of this directly, so everything seems unified. The film is, of course, well known and discussed in textbooks and things for its cinematic technique, and this is going to be what you're going to see most discussed. Right off the bat, the film opens with one of the most intricate uses of singular camera that you will see in a sound feature. It is absolutely remarkable that they pulled this off. But the entire opening of the film actually opens with first-person perspective, singular camera of what is essentially what is Dr. Jekyll's POV. It actually starts with him playing the organ, and this film famously uses the Bach toccata and fugue over the opening titles, really sort of solidifying that as the ultimate cliche for the mad villain playing his organ. And of course they're going to sit down and play Bach toccata and fugue. So it's really this film, and 3 years later in The Black Cat, when Karloff's character plays the toccata and fugue on the organ before the Black Mass. It's these two films that sort of solidify that cliche, if you ever wondered where that came from. But the opening is an incredible usage of singular camera. The camera tracks through Jekyll's really fancy, it's not a mansion, but it's a gigantic London townhouse of sorts, with full singular camera. There's even the incredible bit where there are panning shots, and then he actually comes up to a mirror, and we see our first actual glimpse of Frederic March as Henry Jekyll, actually sort of adjusting his tie and making himself presentable for society. So already setting up that which is the theme of the film, the constricting nature of Victorian society, and having to either present oneself perfectly, lest you let your internal emotions come to the surface and break through a bit, and that'll of course make you ostracized and outcast. And then Jekyll ultimately rejecting all of that by embracing the Hyde persona and after his experimentation. But anyway, then the camera then continues out, actually goes through the open door, and then as Jekyll gets into the carriage, we as Jekyll get into the carriage and then go into what is the medical lecture Jekyll gives, which sets up the whole scientific idea behind his theories, which seem too wild and too profane for the sort of upper crust Victorian mindset to even be able to process, let alone discuss without utter disgust. But it is unbelievably well executed. It's almost it's not exactly necessary when you examine it, but I think it was done by Mamoulian to sort of announce this is going to be a different kind of film, and also to immediately get the audience to associate with Jekyll. And again, the whole reason for subjective camera and POV shots is to get an audience directly in the mindset of a character. And of course, since this entire film is about the disintegration of the mindset of a character and then becoming doubled and split and separated with different parts of a man's psyche, it's vital to do that as early as possible, because of course you're not going to be with the normal person very long, because of course once the experiments start and once Hyde first appears, there is that split between the two, and you're not going to be with the original normal person you start with after that point. So it's vital that you get the audience on Jekyll's side and understanding his own viewpoint as soon as the film starts. So that's why I think it was decided, why Mamoulian went with the subjective camera. But pulling that off technically it's an absolute marvel. And of course, if you can study it closely, and you can start to see the seams and how they put things together and how they moved the gigantic bulky camera and how they were still able to shoot sync sound and do everything. So it's also a marvelous thing to study for the technical side of things. The other aspect that is most often discussed and what you see highlighted the most outside of the subjective camera opening is, of course, the transformation sequences. These are legendary for the fact that, for the most part, particularly the first one is entirely done in camera. Most of the other transformation scenes are also done in camera, and it's only towards some of the later ones where you start to have more of time-lapse photography mixed in. So it starts out entirely in camera, all performance-based with makeup, but the really striking thing is, due to the technical way they devised of shooting the makeup, they were able to actually make the makeup appear in stages in camera. So Frederic March was able to do a in-camera transformation performance just like John Barrymore in the silent version, but also have the benefit of the technical expertise to allow the makeup to actually appear, so his appearance physically changes along with his performance in camera in an unbroken take, and it is extraordinarily uncomfortable to watch to this day. The first time you see this film, it does still make you a little bit queasy in the ways that it should, because this should be absolutely horrifying. And it is remarkable how well this still holds up to this day, even when you know the sort of ins and outs of how they did it by using certain color filters and changing camera lenses as the scene played out to then make the makeup stages visible. But again, it is all based around Frederic March's performance. And the film was originally devised. The idea Paramount wanted was to actually remake the 1920 Barrymore silent version and actually have John Barrymore come back and reprise his famous role in the talkie remake. Barrymore turned the project down, and that's how they eventually wound up going to Frederic March, who was at that time sort of seen as not necessarily a Barrymore surrogate, but Barrymore-esque. So the idea was always to remake the 1920 silent version. So had that just stayed as is and Mamoulian not come on board and really elevated everything, you can see the through line of where the idea came from to do the transformation scene, at least starting out, just like the silent version, all performance-based, as it would be if you were doing it on stage. You have to do it entirely in performance. This, of course, puts even more weight on the shoulders of the actor actually playing Jekyll and Hyde. Not only do you have to play, really three distinct characters. You have to play Jekyll as he is at the beginning of the film. You have to play a distinct version of Jekyll and Hyde. So those are two distinct characters. So basically you have to play Jekyll normal, and then Jekyll under stress, and Hyde. So there's technically three. And like the silent version does, and like the 1941 version does a little bit, the actual makeup for Hyde and the way Hyde acts and performs visibly deteriorates over the course of the film. So every time you see Hyde, the makeup is actually a little bit different, and it gets more grotesque just as his actions grow more grotesque. As the more time Jekyll spends as Hyde, the more Hyde becomes more vicious and more animal-like and more bestial. This is hinted at in the 41 version a little bit, but they don't really go full tilt into that. There is a good deal of it in the 1920 version, with Barrymore's makeup becoming a bit more grotesque over the film. But here in the 1931 Mamoulian version, it goes to the extreme, and the idea for that Mamoulian had, and when he went with the makeup that was designed by Wally Westmore, was that Hyde in this film was much more of the Neanderthal type man. So that's why you have the sort of ape-like makeup, and you have the big teeth, and he's a very ugly fellow. I mean, he definitely looks the least human of all of the major Hydes on screen. It does take some getting used to a little bit when you see the film the first time, because Hyde is so ape-like. But the makeup is absolutely striking. And of course, as with a good number of Jack Pierce's iconic Universal makeups, it doesn't stay the same. So as I said, it actually grows over the course of the film. And by growing here, it physically deteriorates. So the first Hyde is sort of not necessarily. Well, I guess technically he's the prettiest looking version. It's like he's the young Hyde, and then by the end of the film, you have this version of Hyde at his most grotesque, with his skin all bunched up and his eyes exposed and bloodshot, and he looks the most bestial of all the versions of Hyde. But it's not just the physical change; it's the actual actions that go along with it, because the initial actions of Hyde are almost childlike in a way. He is discovering the world for the first time, and the things that he does to sort of rebuke Victorian society constraining human emotion and desire can be reflected in that sort of childish way. They're small things, and it's a bit for a laugh, but you can see the internal darkness brewing within, and even mixed in the childish are things that are a bit dangerous or a bit threatening, and those only increase. Again, the more of Hyde's appearances, the more time Jekyll spends as Hyde, and he sort of completely loses himself in being Hyde. So the whole notion of it being a mere scientific experiment really goes out the window pretty quickly. Again, this is drawing very heavily from the stage adaptation. So we once again have the love interest, and we have the father who doesn't really like Jekyll all that much, and is sort of supposed to be the antagonist and physical manifestation of the constricting nature of Victorian society that Jekyll is always struggling against. It must be said that as I talked about when I talked about the silent version, I do have an issue with some of the things the stage play introduced into sort of the popular consciousness. I still personally prefer Stevenson's original novel, even though the whole twist of Jekyll and Hyde is so well known that if you were to do a direct adaptation of Stevenson's novel, it would sort of almost have to be a sort of old-fashioned mystery, a very, in some ways, a very Sherlock Holmesian type approach, because that's the feeling you get when you read the actual novella that Stevenson wrote. Because, again, everybody knows the story of Jekyll and Hyde in broad strokes, so to have that as sort of a twist surprise, it's obviously not surprising anymore. So it makes sense you have to change it around a little bit, but I've never been quite sold on the adding of a love interest. And of course, Jekyll in the original novella is much older, and there's some different bits of social hierarchy being examined that are not really in the films. And this is clearly drawing from the Barrymore 1920 silent version. So it's interesting to note things that they also shifted from that. Here, Jekyll is, of course, young and dashing in the person of Frederic March and full of energy, and that automatically sets him apart from everyone else we see as part of Victorian life. So it's nice to already get that distinction automatically from the beginning. So we know that Jekyll is already an outsider and is struggling with all of this stuff. But it's interesting to note that he's never portrayed quite as saintly as Jekyll is in the 1920 version, when Barrymore plays him. And there's also a bit of that in the 1941 MGM remake with Spencer Tracy, which was famously a production code enforced film. And while it is a direct remake of this 1931 version, it really, it has all the teeth removed, and you know that from the opening, because the opening of the 41 version literally takes place in a church, because it's in Louis B. Mayer's magical MGM land of everything being perfect. So it has none of the PreCode darkness of the 1931 version, which leads most everyone to say it's inferior or not any good, which I think is unfair, because there are some really interesting things in the 41 version, and Tracy's performance is really striking, but it's all really a psychologically based performance. It's really a different animal to the 31 version. What doesn't do it favors is the fact that it's basically just rewriting the 1931 screenplay, and all the teeth are removed. So it didn't do anyone any favors to simply remake the 31 version. They should have just started from scratch, which apparently is what Spencer Tracy wanted to do, and do their own thing and be more radical and doing their own new version. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but it makes a fascinating comparison. But when you compare the two, there is no comparison, because this film, I think the most important thing Mamoulian did was to make this film feel as wicked and malevolently gleeful about being wicked as Hyde himself is. So the film really does reflect this version of Hyde, and it makes the audience kind of get in on the action a little bit, and sort of the voyeur experiencing a bit of that passion as a side effect. But very quickly, that starts to turn, and that's especially when the character of Ivy is introduced. So Ivy is, of course, played by Miriam Hopkins. She is the prostitute who Jekyll rescues, and then, of course, is so sexually alluring and practically throws herself at Jekyll that when Hyde finally appears, that one of the first things he decides to go and do is look up old Ivy, and then engage in as much sexual debauchery and torture of another person as is humanly possible. This is obviously and easily the most sexually explicit and sexually charged of all the adaptations. This is, again, drawing from the stage play, and the idea is that you have this sort of quote-unquote bad woman in Ivy, being the prostitute, being the sort of mirror opposite of Jekyll's love interest and the girl he's so desperate to marry. So you have the sort of good and bad mirror images to give a sort of female perspective to the mirror images of Jekyll and Hyde. It makes sense why this was done. It's, maybe a little bit on the nose. Again, this is directly drawing from the stage play. None of this is in Stevenson's original novella. But here, I think it's done the best because Hopkins's performance is magnificent, and she is able to convey such a sense of, at first, promiscuity, of absolute sexiness. This is the actual scene where Jekyll rescues her and then takes her back to her bedroom, and she undresses for him and then gets in bed. That was the subject of much censorship, and there's even, some of that is still unfortunately missing as far as we can tell. But even there, the amount of sexual byplay and innuendo and the sheer sexual charge of that scene. There is no nudity. There is no bare flesh really seen at all. But it still remains one of the most sexually charged moments in all of pre-code Hollywood. It is famous, of course, for the swinging leg that closes the scene when Jekyll goes to leave and Ivy just says, "Come back," and her voice sort of echoes hauntingly and burns itself into Jekyll's brain, and then she dangles her bare leg. And then in another of Mamoulian's sort of what would be termed, artier flourishes, but that actually is held. There's a really long dissolve. This is actually done a number of times to get, again, the psyche of Jekyll really exposed. It's a really interesting way of using cinematic technique to get across a character's internal monologue. And here, what it manages to do, this is the most famous example in the film, of which there are a great many. But here, as Jekyll leaves and puts his hat back on, and as they're going down the staircase, we hold that shot in the dissolve. It literally stays there as Ivy's leg keeps swinging, and then it starts to gradually fade away. The idea is that this is a visual representation of that memory going down into Jekyll's subconscious and being sort of filed away. And that's got to be one of the first things that comes out when Hyde first appears, because Hyde is really the manifestation of the subconscious and really the sort of Jekyll's id, the sort of primordial man, the sort of primordial lust and urge to live all of life to the fullest, and is Jekyll's id unleashed and just boundless with energy and without any sort of rationality or common sense or thought for anything other than the pursuit of the fruits of life itself. It's a really interesting thing. The usage of superimposing and the really long dissolves, suggesting visually Jekyll's subconscious and his mental state, is along with the opening singular camera and the couple other shots of actual first-person perspective from Jekyll's point of view that we get scattered throughout the rest of the film. Those are the two biggest examples, I think, of Mamoulian trying some different techniques to try and elevate this film over just being an early talkie. And these are what would be termed the sort of artier flourishes. I know not everyone is a fan of them. Some do feel they make the actual idea stick out a bit much, and it seems, it's a bit obvious. I think they are implemented well, and I think they are wonderfully striking, and they are a part of why this film is so iconic and why it stands alone as such an iconic film experience and remains the best Jekyll and Hyde film adaptation that has ever been done. I myself, I think that they are striking. They might be maybe a tad heavy-handed here and there in terms of once you see this film a couple times, then they do stick out a bit more. But it is, of course, still 1931. This is still an early talkie, and had Mamoulian continued with using these time and time again, I think they might have been a bit more refined. These are sort of, I mean, they're really experimental in the best sense of the word. This is not something you were seeing in a lot of other films. If you look at a lot of other films from 1931, which contains some of the greatest films ever made, they are, for the most part, much more straightforward. You weren't seeing very arty flourishes like this. And had this film been made anywhere other than Paramount, I don't really see them allowing that to be in the release print. So it's amazing what Mamoulian was able to get away with. So while some of these techniques may stick out a little bit in terms of being so distinctly different, I think it's remarkable how well they're achieved with the technology of the time, with the technique of the time, and the fact that Mamoulian was able to get away with even using them and having them in the release version in the first place. Again, all of this stuff is important because it is allowing you to more associate with Jekyll's own internal monologue. Of course, all of this would be completely worthless if you didn't have just an amazing actor in the part. And of course, this is having to follow on the heels of John Barrymore playing the role and really defining it for the silent era. So that's an additional crap ton of weight on an actor's shoulders. And the fact that Frederic March is able to work with all of this, and again, provide not just one, but really two, and I'd argue probably even three different distinct, really iterations of different characterizations. And as the film progresses, Jekyll deteriorates, Hyde deteriorates, and deteriorates physically in terms of his stature and his grotesqueness and the grotesqueness of his actions. But he becomes the stronger of the two in terms of spirit and energy, and becomes very quickly the more dominant of the two. So it's really not just a dual performance, but Frederic March in this film is nothing short of a revelation. It is not just a performance in terms of trying to define all these different aspects of what is ostensibly one character, and then manifesting itself in multiple different performances that are full of nuance and development over the course of the story, and have to modulate accordingly to each scene. It is not just a performance of playing the polar opposites linked in this sort of internal duality battle as being the manifestations of the warring sides of every human psyche. But it's also an incredibly physical performance because of the ape-like simian Neanderthal man nature of Hyde that Mamoulian was so interested in exploring. This leads Hyde to be a much more physical being. And when you see March in his scenes as Jekyll, he's always playing him with a sort of restrained energy, like that's wanting to always burst out as he wants to rail against the stupidity of the Victorian repression, and how it's keeping him from exploring everything he wants to in the world of science and marrying his great love. And he just feels extraordinarily repressed, but he can't really express that or put it into words, so he just remains a bit of an outcast and seen as a bit of an idealist and a sort of not quite a crazy person, but seen as that always outsider figure, and not ever being able to be fully indoctrinated into Victorian society. So as Hyde, all of that bursts through, and it's most striking when you can see the sort of Jekyllisms in Hyde, and of course the reverse when you see the inherent bits of Hyde that are already there in Jekyll. So this is a film that definitely, the more you see it, the more nuances will become exposed in March's performance and Mamoulian's direction of all of these elements. It is an unbelievably complex characterization and performance, and it still boggles the mind trying to understand how one actor can do all of this and make it seem so vivid, because none of this seems studied, or it doesn't seem like it's trying to be overly actorly. Although there is one moment in the finale when Jekyll is renouncing his love that a lot of people point at as being, because the dialogue's a little bit more flowery and it kind of feels like it's ripped right out of the stage play. And that is usually criticized a little bit, but that's not really March's performance. I don't think it's really more of the dialogue being, again, a little more flowery and a bit more stage-bound. But it is just an unbelievably remarkable piece of performance, because, again, it's not just an incredibly physical performance, and you also have to count in the fact that the makeup was extraordinarily arduous and done in 1931, so just like Jack Pierce's iconic makeups and that Boris Karloff suffered through, and many others would, it was a makeup that March had to suffer through, and the fact that it progressed over the course of the film meant that it was not the same and had to change, and it had to become even more arduous. So when this film was over, Frederic March had to deal with the sort of come down from this film physically, because he had to check into a hospital for exhaustion. His face was almost torn to bits by the makeup, and it was a extraordinarily arduous process physically, and had to have been, of course, mentally as well. And through all of this, having to live up to the shadow that John Barrymore cast over the role, even though the silent film had been 11 years before by this point. The whole project was started as a remake, hopefully trying to get Barrymore to reprise the role. So the fact that March was ostensibly the second or third choice, and having to live up to the great profile himself as in one of his most iconic silent roles, had to have been definitely a challenge for any actor. But to have that on top of such a physically and mentally and emotionally demanding multiple role, because again, I think all the different reflections of the two parts of Jekyll's psyche, it's not just a dual role. When you do this story right, it's not just a dual role, because Hyde doesn't stay the same and Jekyll doesn't stay the same. And also Jekyll at the beginning of the story is different from where Jekyll ends up. So there's multiple facets of each side of the persona that this remains the de facto standard. This is the Jekyll and Hyde performance that all others are measured against. And no one has equaled it yet. There are some really striking ones. I think Barrymore's Jekyll and Hyde performance is magnificent, and I think Spencer Tracy's Jekyll and Hyde performance is really striking, and it's so striking that it really deserves a stronger film around it, because again, it was originally going to be the idea was they wanted to make a different film, but they fell back on remaking the Paramount version and taking all the teeth out of it, so it had no bite. But Tracy was still doing a psychologically based performance, so it's a different animal to what March is doing here. And it's a really striking, phenomenal performance that manages to be scary like March as Hyde, but it's a different sort of scariness. It's rooted in a different realm. So it's not exactly fair to compare the two. But March here, especially when Hyde, the most horrifying moments of the film are what Hyde is when he is at his most vindictive towards Ivy. So this film kind of becomes a sort of two-hander between Frederic March and Miriam Hopkins, who is unbelievably excellent and so totally pitiable as Ivy, especially because Ivy starts as such a strong-willed character and is very quickly turned into just a blubbering, terrified wreck, a shell of a human being, from being Hyde's kept woman and being abused and sexually manipulated and controlled every second of every day, so much to the point that even when Hyde is not around, the mere specter of his presence, the mere thought of Hyde is enough to just make her flesh actually quiver in terror. And so when he actually does appear, when she actually does cross him, the level of suspense that's generated knowing what just the even the considering the possibilities of what Hyde might do to Ivy is so completely horrifying that they are really the scariest moments of the entire film, and has nothing to do with the body horror of the transformation or even Jekyll eventually terrifyingly becoming Hyde involuntarily without the usage of his experimental drugs. That was really the most terrifying part of Stevenson's original novella. But here, because of the audience sympathy for Ivy's character and the strength of Hopkins's performance, I think it's one of her best performances in any film, and she should have been nominated for an Oscar as well because she's phenomenal here. Those are the most terrifying parts of the film, and it's. In fact, they're so terrifying, you feel so badly for Ivy that it does sort of make you not really associate with Jekyll all that much, because when you look at the way the script is done, and again, this is not the film, not the performances, but it's more in the script, and because it's drawing from the stage play, the way the script is laid out here, it's not as easy to sympathize with Jekyll as it is in the Barrymore or MGM remake versions, because Jekyll is much more saintly there. Here, the whole notion for Jekyll even doing his experiment, and this is tying into the very PreCode sexual undercurrent that seems to drive everything in this film. The whole reason why Jekyll even does this experiment in the first place is it's kind of because his fiance's father rejects their marriage and says they have to wait, and then he can't be so impatient. So because Jekyll is impatient and because he's really horny, essentially, he does the experiment anyway, and it's interesting how Mamoulian directs the first transformation scene and most of the others, that Jekyll does this and he locks the door and he gets all frenzied and quickly writes a note, I may die, but I had to, pursue science. Sorry, dear, I loved you, but I'm probably going to die. Bye. But he's starting to do things and set up the room and get more and more frenzied, almost like he's a teenager about to do something really naughty that he knows he shouldn't do. So again, there's a whole sexual undercurrent to practically everything in this film. But my point is, and the way I've always felt a little bit about this is, because Hyde is so villainous towards Ivy and does so many reprehensible things, he is, I think, the most monstrous overall of all of the various Hyde adaptations, and thus not only the most monstrous, the scariest, and the one that the audience is most really repulsed by. And that, of course, the idea of Hyde being so repulsive and sort of a knee-jerk response fashion to everyone he encounters is directly from Stevenson's original novella. But because Hyde is so monstrous here, and the whole the tragic element is, I think, downplayed, or at least not as present as it is in the sort of bookending versions around here. I think it is much harder to associate as much with Jekyll in this film, because Hyde is so monstrous and so villainous, and the fact that Jekyll kind of just does this because he can't get married so fast. So it's harder to associate with Jekyll here. And of course, any Jekyll and Hyde story, the first time he's going to experiment on himself, all you can do is sit there and go, "This is a bad idea. Don't do this." But anyway, it's really fantastic when the film builds up to the sort of explosions in Ivy's presence, and not just that they're physically violent. It's that the energy explodes, and so they build to almost unbearable levels of suspense, and in terms of what Hyde may or may not do. And it's fascinating seeing the two actors go toe to toe. So those are really two-hander scenes between two different actors, and Marion Hopkins is often. She isn't talked about enough for the strength of her performance in this film, which is magnificent. But it's hard when everything is overshadowed by Frederic March in this film, and he of course rightly won the Oscar for his performance here. It was back in the days when the voting was a little bit different, so it was actually he won in a sort of tie with Wallace Beery, but his performance here is so unbelievable, and again so nuanced in all the different renderings of the two characters, and then having to do everything through the progressive makeup, and also having to physically show Hyde's complete freeing of all of Victorian society constraints, and again sort of the physical version of Jekyll's own id, is just mesmerizing and haunting and striking and repulsive and terrifying, and all of the ways that make this still the definitive film adaptation of the Jekyll and Hyde story. I think in particular, if I had to name one specific moment, I think it's really it has nothing to do with fancy cinematic technique, but it seems almost something that was improvised, and also shows the unbelievable strength of Wally Westmore's makeup design, the fact that it was able to stand up to this. But there's a moment in one of the early transformation sequences when Hyde is going out on the town, and he steps out of the back of the lab door, of course, the back door on the back street, this sort of sordid entrance, and goes to put on the top hat and the cape, and of course it starts raining, and he goes outside and the rain starts pelting him. And it's that particular moment when Hyde looks up at the rain, takes his hat off, and then just lets the rain pelt his face, and basks on the fact that he's getting rained on, and lets out this huge satisfied gasp of being so satisfied to be alive and be pelted by rain, and opens his mouth and lets it fill with rainwater. For me, every time I see that particular moment, that's the scene for me. And you see that, and it's like that's what won Frederic March the Oscar. That particular scene, that is absolute magic, and entirely down to performance, lighting, staging. And again, the makeup actually being able to get wet and still allow that level of performance. There is no artifice anywhere in March's performance, anywhere in the makeup. He's having to do it through even multiple sets of false teeth, so he's even having to enunciate differently. It's an unbelievable level of performance that has never been equaled by somebody having to do that much work in one film, in one technical performance that's so varied and so physically and emotionally complex, and representing multiple facets of different characters. It's just an unbelievable experience, and of course this was the first major Oscar win for a horror film, and that would not be repeated really until, if you count Silence of the Lambs, when Anthony Hopkins won Best Actor for playing Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs all the way in 1991. So there's a significant gap there, and I'm just glad March was recognized at this time, because it's still one of the riveting performances of all horror cinema. Really, I mean, it's still unmatched in both physicality, emotion, and the sheer terror that's manifested when Hyde is at his most villainous is extraordinarily horrific. So, of course, befitting the fact that really earning this film its horror film moniker. And it has the sort of classical ending that all Jekyll and Hyde stories must have, but not to spoil it for anyone, but I think just the final little grace note that this is something truly special, and the whole film has served the story to its most minute degree of being wonderfully perverse and morbid, and sort of darkly humorous in all the best ways, but also reveling in this darkness, just as Hyde does. When we have the sort of preordained conclusion of all Jekyll and Hyde stories, going back to Stevenson's original novella ending as well, it doesn't end quite like the 1920 version, where when Barrymore's character exits, that there's this sort of very tragic ending. Here, it's a little bit tragic. Well, it's definitely tragic, but it has that one little final note that maybe not everyone's going to get, but there's one little grace note of action that goes on in the very last shot. That for me is sort of Rouben Mamoulian. It's almost like he's signing the film as like that's the one last little touch of morbidity and intelligence. It's like a wink at the audience. It's like that last little burst of creative energy of what is Jekyll's final fate. It's not just that final denouement. It's that one last little bit of physical action when the camera pulls back for the very final shot of the film as it goes to fade out to the end credits. And that, for me, that's the moment that cements the whole film as to date the definitive Jekyll and Hyde adaptation, even though it is drawing more from the stage play that I'm not as much of a fan of. So it's for all of these reasons, and of course many more, why this film remains the definitive Jekyll and Hyde adaptation. It is unmatched in its gleefulness, and that's that gleefulness, that sort of dark humor that runs throughout, that helps things play a little bit more and helps to alleviate some of the extreme tension that comes in the darkest sequences. And it's also an extraordinarily daring film, being one of the most vivid of all pre-code Hollywood titles. It isn't afraid to go to darker places and to also utilize cinematic techniques that are rarely performed, and when they are done, they almost are never as well executed as they are here. So this is a film that deserves to be watched every year in a horror season. This is a film that deserves to be studied for its cinematic technique. It deserves to be studied for being the finest of all the Jekyll and Hyde adaptations that have ever been done. And of course, it deserves to be studied for its direction, its photography, beautiful photography by Carl Struess. Being a Paramount film from the pre-code era and all that entails with the sort of studio house styles. But chiefly, it must be studied for the unbelievable performance by Frederic March, which is still one of the great leading actor performances, I think, in any film, regardless of genre, and for being a complete work of creativity and just extraordinary genius and artistic abilities from Rouben Mamoulian, who is, I think, one of the great directors of all of Hollywood history, and never gets the credit he deserves. And he didn't really stay in particular genres. So I think it's kind of a shame he didn't really come back to the horror genre really all that much. But I also wish he had directed more pictures, actually, because I think it's a shame he didn't direct as many things as he possibly could have. But every picture he made had a particular sensibility, and that, I think, is what really makes the 1931 Paramount Frederic March starring version of Jekyll and Hyde so incredibly unique. It's all these elements coming together in the pre-code era at Paramount. So it doesn't just wind up being a talky remake of the 1920 silent version, and it remains the greatest adaptation of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde that has ever been done. And unless somebody does a direct adaptation of Stevenson's novella without any of the stage play elements, I don't think anybody's going to ever match the darkness and the glee at which this film operates, and the creativity on display. All these elements, I don't think anyone will ever match the energy or precision of creative technique that's seen in the 1931 Jekyll and Hyde. I still would really love to see someone do a really painstaking direct adaptation of Stevenson's original novella, but that would also be a different animal because the stage play introduced so many different changes. So I think the 31 Jekyll and Hyde remains the most fascinating, the most timeless, and the best adaptation ever done of Robert Louis Stevenson's immortal story. So that brings us to the brand new 2022 Warner Archive Blu-ray release. This is entirely from their new restoration of the surviving original source materials, and also having to source from other places the original material from the original 1931 theatrical release, and then reinserting it into the picture and having to deal with all of the multitude of problems that have happened to this film entirely due to its poor treatment over the years, and a lot of that stemming from not only the code reissue later on in the 30s, but the process of MGM buying up all extant and known copies of the film, suppressing and destroying as much as they could in order to promote only their 1941 remake. This was not the only example of MGM doing this, and thankfully this film didn't get quite as bad treatment-wise as what happened to the original British version of Gaslight, which was almost entirely lost. But this film, for a good number of years, was unavailable, and you were not able to see it at all. And then when it finally started coming back to circulation, it was only in the cut version. So the fact that we even have this film, and we have it with almost all of the original footage restored and as close as is known to the original release version as humanly possible, is a miracle. And speaking of miracles, what Warner Archive has pulled off this time, I don't know how they did it. This film, again, has been stuck in such a state that it was always felt it would take way too much time and money to try and bring it to Blu-ray, which is why it was one of the titles requested for a long time, but it was unknown whether the elements would really stand up to Blu-ray. And the DVD, well, it was, again, the sort of attempt at restoring the original version, it did still have quite a bit of damage printed in, and it was carrying over a lot of stuff that was found on the Laserdisc master, which, again, same sort of thing, restoring the original edit, but with the inherent source problems going on, meaning that no matter what you do, unless somehow some pristine foreign uncut negative turns up or something like that, as what happened on King Kong, there's not likely going to ever be a chance that this film will ever look and sound spotless. They've really pulled a rabbit out of the hat with this one, because with me saying that, when you get this disc, it is unbelievably astounding quality-wise, and it's just about as close to spotless as I think you can possibly get. In fact, I never thought this film could look and sound this good in terms of the overall presentation. And unless you have trained eyes or you have a lot of experience in looking at restorations, or you know quite a bit about vintage film materials and preservation and so on and so forth, for the general viewer, this is going to seem absolutely spotless and like it was made yesterday. And the fact that this is still only a Blu-ray release, and you can watch this on a 4K television, and it will bowl you over. Yeah, because it does rival 4K UHD titles. It's one of those Warner Archive discs that you wish they had been able to just release it also as a UHD. And if they do jump into UHD at some point, this would be one of those titles that one would hope that they would also release as a UHD, because the results really are that impressive. So to talk about the picture quality, this is another absolutely, I don't know how they did it, a quality level of restoration, of bringing a film back from the seemingly dead. It is absolutely staggering in quality. It is such a quantum leap beyond the old releases that if you've only ever seen this film on the old releases, it will be like seeing it for the first time. And even if you're watching it on a 4K TV upscaled to 4K, it's still it rivals UHD titles. It's that level of the high standard Warner Archive quality. But for this title being in such bad shape for all these years, for it to finally be able to look this good is really astounding, and shows you what the modern digital technology available to film preservation and restoration processes has opened up for films that were deemed unsalvageable or unable to move past a certain point in the photochemical era. So what seemed impossible back when, say, they made the DVD back in the early 2000s, or especially when they made the Laserdisc, it's now possible to go far beyond that. And this is easily one of the jaw-dropping restorations of the year, one of the restorations of the decade, even though we're just now into the decade. And were it not for Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm that Warner Archive also did, this would definitely probably be disc of the year. Even with that, it's neck and neck with Brothers Grimm. That's how impressive this restoration work is. So of course you are dealing with different elements, and you're dealing with quite substantial damage to the sources that survive, and you're also dealing with only limited surviving sources. So there are going to be some inescapable things, and again, I think it's going to be, if you're a more eagle-eyed viewer, or you are used to looking at a lot of these types of materials where you're dealing with severely limited sources, or very painstaking preservation efforts that are dealing with what survives, then you might start to see, I guess, more of the seams of the restoration, if you will, which is just unavoidable stuff. So in terms of what you're looking at in this release, it is a absolutely breathtaking new picture master from this restoration. I expected it to look quite substantially fantastic coming from Warner Archive, and new image harvests and new scans and new restoration work, but I never expected it to be able to look this good. It is staggeringly good looking. The only things I think people are going to notice if you really pay attention, and again, if you look at a lot more of this stuff in the technical realm, and again, this is all down to what are the elements that survive and what they're having to work with, there are, the big thing is there are a number of instances of some missing frames. Some of that is in the originally cut and restored material, but there are one or two other spots throughout the feature where there are some very tiny missing frames. Usually some are only even just one frame that's missing, and again, that is entirely down to the fact that MGM really screwed up this film's preservation history in their absolutely insane practice of buying up and withholding and attempting to destroy previous films when they would go to remake them. This film suffered greatly due to that, and thankfully it was able to escape MGM's clutches and not be destroyed. But other films fared even worse, unfortunately. I still don't understand why people would think it was a good idea to sell the rights to their successful films simply for remakes. That should have never have happened or have been allowed. But that complicates everything. So the fact that there are some occasional missing frames is unfortunate, but that is, again, entirely baked into the source problems itself, and there's no avoiding that or escaping that, again, unless some miraculous foreign negative or export negative or alternative source turns up, like some fine-grain print that might be somehow in a British vault or somewhere that just magically turns up, which it has happened. Again, that's what happened on King Kong. There was a British fine-grain negative source that miraculously turned up, and that's what they were able to use for the DVD and Blu-ray and finally restore all of the cut footage in pristine quality. It's probably not going to happen with this film, but that would be the only way that you would possibly be able to do anything further restoration-wise than what has already been done here. So while there are some missing frames, they're never obtrusive. And they're so tiny that most people will probably not notice them. And if you do, it's almost like your mind's playing tricks on you, because it's like they're so fleeting, you hardly notice it. So that is, I think, the only big sort of qualm you'll notice, but that is entirely due to what source survives. As soon as you see those opening titles, the clarity difference will just jump out at you. And then as soon as you jump into the opening of the film with the subjective camera, you are not prepared for this. If you've ever seen this film before, you are not prepared to see it in this level of quality. It is absolutely staggering. So if if I had to recommend 2 Warner Archive discs to purchase this year, it would obviously be Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm and this release of the 1931 Jekyll and Hyde, because they are unbelievably staggering. And this is total disc of the year quality. This is mind-boggling level of restoration work that I never thought was possible. Of course, this is a title many have requested since Warner Archive started doing Blu-rays, and it was always said to be too difficult, or the elements wouldn't stand up to doing a Blu-ray release, and it would require a lot of time and money and effort and things, and it was well worth the wait. Let's put it that way. If you're going to do something, do it right. And again, this is an unbelievably astonishing presentation. So worth it for the visuals alone. Worth it. This should be a disc you should have to pay a crazy amount of money for, because the transfer is that good. So if you love horror films, you need this disc. If you want to support film preservation, and you should, you need this disc. If you want to support great Blu-ray releases and the Warner Archive label, you need this disc. If you love PreCode Hollywood, you need this disc. If you want to see one of the great Oscar-winning performances, you need this disc. If you're a big fan of auteur theory, you need this disc, because Mamoulian is underrated. If you have a Blu-ray player, you need this disc. It's at that level, like Brothers Grimm, because this is just staggeringly good work. And the fact that its list price is only the usual $20, and it has been frequently on sale for under that. And honestly, at some points, it's dropped down to like about $13, which is unbelievable. This is a miraculous restoration of a disc. I mean, it is. Again, I was speechless watching this. I never thought they could pull the rabbit out of the hat like this. I thought it would be good. I thought it would be excellent, but I thought it would be severely limited. And here, they have really worked miracles. There are, I will say, I did notice 1 or 2 spots where if you look closely, you can kind of tell where they have had to mix in some alternate sources, but the actual work and effort taken to try and homogenize and match them as close as humanly possible without messing anything up or going too heavy-handed like some restorations will do is very, very extraordinarily intricate and well done. And when you know more of the technical aspects of how this work has to be done and how difficult it is, and especially with a film like this where the release history and the preservation history is extraordinarily complicated and the sources being worked with are extremely fragile and have been battered around for years, and the fact that we almost lost the film due to MGM being insane, it really makes you appreciate the work all the more. So even if you watch very closely and you maybe can spot some of the missing frames and some of the little tiny segments where they've had to source in from other sources, and then for restoring the censored footage from the original PreCode release, there is obviously going to be a little bit of fluctuation, but it is handled so well and so naturally that it really does approach that wonderful, seamless quality. So again, for 99% of people, they aren't going to see any of this, and it's just going to be a vision, because the work is so well done. My hat's off to the entire department. I don't know how they did it. I really don't. All you have to do is go back to the DVD for 5 minutes. And, I mean, not even 5 minutes. You could just pop in the DVD for 30 seconds, and you'll notice the difference immediately. The Laserdisc is a little rougher than that. So if you go back to that, and you'll really see it even a bit rougher. So this is absolutely worth every penny. One of the must-own discs of the year. One of the finest releases the archive has yet done. They keep surpassing themselves somehow. So this was a title everybody was looking forward to as soon as it got announced. So if anyone hasn't gotten it by now, please go and get a copy. This is one of those, if you if you love classic films, if you own a Blu-ray player, which you obviously do if you're watching this video, you've got to go and get a copy of this because it is absolutely staggering. As for the audio, it also got a new restoration of the surviving elements. This is, as usual, in DTS HDMI lossless mono, and the quality difference over the DVD already is just, if the picture is an astonishing improvement, so is the audio, because unfortunately the DVD suffered from very murky audio that was not very good. And in fact, it was far inferior to what's on the Laserdisc. So actually, for the past number of years when I watched the film, I usually watched the Laserdisc because the audio was much better. Here, it's actually mastered at a little bit higher level than either of the previous releases. They were much quieter, and it sounds remarkably clear. Again, especially since the DVD was extremely murky and muddled and just didn't sound very good. And comparing it to the Laserdisc, you can tell that there has been some new restoration work, and some bits are notably clearer. One or two of the missing bits of frames do unfortunately mar one or two lines of dialogue, in terms of it does unfortunately trim a word or two in one or two spots. It's been that way on all the releases, and again, that is just an unfortunate side effect of the film suffering for many, many years at the hands of MGM. So again, we're lucky to have the film in this state at all and have any of the censored footage restored, let alone practically every bit that anyone is aware of. So it's not going to be a pristine audio presentation in those terms because of the sources that survive. However, it has gone through the same painstaking restoration process, and it is the clearest sounding version of the film that I have heard. In comparing it to the other releases, again, you can pretty much just throw out the DVD because it was super murky and just it was muddled, and it has never sounded very good. The Laserdisc does have quite a bit more natural hiss left in it, but it is mastered at a much lower volume. So I did do my usual sort of spot comparisons between the two, and the Blu-ray audio is much clearer, and it is obviously mastered at a higher volume level. And you can tell that they've gone in and tried to clean up the track as best as they could and try to reveal more of the, especially more of the high end, which is usually the addition. That's where you get the additional bit of clarity in a lot of these older films that go through restoration work at Warner Archive. Titles, of course, that had big improvements were obviously like Mad Love. Here, I think the Laserdisc still holds its own, and it's kind of hard to tell which might be preferable. Again, I did try to level match them when I was doing my spot comparisons, but I do think the Blu-ray audio is the superior choice, and I think they did a remarkable job with the audio sources that survive. So I do think this is an example, again, of where you can upgrade wholeheartedly over previous versions, and I think the audio is really remarkably well done, especially considering the poor state of the materials that survived. Now, to talk about the packaging, all we have to talk about is just the main key art, which beautifully uses one of the original 1931 release posters with the wonderful green looking so striking on this. So there's no mistaking this for any other version when you see this. And I always love how Warner Archive uses original poster artwork. And even though it's just a simple standard Blu-ray case with no frills, no booklet, no anything, that does keep the price down. And to be quite honest, I would much rather have all the money go into the quality of the restoration work and the presentation and the disc mastering than anything else. And it seems like the vast majority of the boutique market is always so focused on all of the physical packaging and the slipcovers and the swag and the boxes full of junk like the standard Warner Studio label and things. I don't care about any of that. And by not having any of that, all the focus goes where it should, and it also keeps the cost down so more people can buy copies and afford it and buy more archive releases. So I'm perfectly fine with this not having any sort of fancy packaging. Standard Warner Archive spine. I do like how they have added the year on there because, of course, they also released the 41 version this year. So when you have them on the shelf together, you can actually tell which you're grabbing when you're grabbing it off the shelf because, of course, we all have them next to each other. Then the rear in the new sort of standard Warner Archive style. I get that to focus a little bit. And we have some stills of Freddy in all his various guises as both Jekyll and Hyde. And then the disc label, as all Warner Archive discs do, has the art from the cover, and they always nicely get the center portion. So here you get both sides of Jekyll on the disc itself. To talk about the extras, this does port over what was available on the DVD, but there is one very important inclusion as well. Warner Archive doesn't really do new extras unless it's a rare special edition, like Curse of Frankenstein, or they have occasionally started doing audio commentaries, particularly from the great horror historians. And they have done a new commentary here, which is great because I think commentaries are really undervalued, and they're a phenomenal way to get the most bang for your buck in terms of the content of the extras. So I'd much rather have a great commentary than a couple short featurettes that they had to spend more time and money in making. So here, ported over is the absolute must-listen Greg Mank commentary from the DVD, which is another of his essential, one of the best commentaries ever recorded tracks. If you've never heard one of his tracks, he has a remarkable talent for doing great commentary work and also recounting all kinds of great production factoids, and all with a wonderful humorous charm. And he is one of the great horror historians, author of many essential horror history tomes. So that is thankfully carried over because it is one of the great audio commentaries, period. But then we also have a new track by the usual team of Steve Haberman with Konstantin Nasser. They did a track for Warner's Curse of Frankenstein as well. But here, they do manage to do a new track without, covering all the same ground as Greg Mank did, and enhance your viewing of the film. So it's great to listen to both commentary tracks; they're both worth your time. But they do talk about, a bit that's happened since the original DVD release. And they do talk a little bit about the new restoration and some of the new historical production information they've uncovered, which is always really fascinating. So the fact that we have the DVD extras, the Greg Mank commentary ported over, and a brand new commentary along with the amazing restoration work. I mean, this was already a must-own. This would have been a must-own if they literally just mailed you a disc with the picture master in a paper bag without any artwork. It would still be one of the discs of the year if they just did that. But the fact that they actually did a new commentary with Nasser and Haberman is icing on the cake. Then additionally, we have a really fascinating radio broadcast from 1950 where Frederic March actually reprises his role as Jekyll and Hyde, and it's actually losslessly encoded as well, which is a real nice surprise because that rarely happens when radio plays are included. It's obviously abridged and done for radio and toned down a bit, but it's fascinating to see this apparently the only time that March came back to one of his most iconic roles, and of course being radio, it's audio only, and it's fascinating here his approach to the role all these years later, and of course voice only. And then lastly, they include the classic Looney Tunes short Hide and Hair. But it's a standard def upscale, so it looks pretty good, but the problem is, and I don't know what caused this, but it's the same thing that happened on the Archives release of Mark of the Vampire that came out at the same time around Halloween. That had some frame rate issues on the standard def extras included. And unfortunately, that happens here with the Looney Tunes short. So it's standard def, but it seems to have some sort of frame rate problem where it continually runs in a sort of jerky, slow motion. I don't know what causes that, or I guess maybe it was somehow in the conversion process from bringing an old standard def piece and putting it on Blu-ray. Something went wrong in the conversion or encoding process. So just like Mark of the Vampire, the standard def short included, unfortunately, has frame rate problems. So it's not really enjoyable to watch. You can still watch it. I mean, I'd already seen seen it before, and you can find it on the Golden Collections if you want to see the short properly. But it's unfortunate. That's the only thing that really mars this release, is that the Looney Tunes short, which of course is tied in to it, actually featuring a Jekyll and Hyde character, and it's a great classic short with bugs. But unfortunately, it has a frame rate problem, so I wouldn't recommend watching it on this disc. Just watch it in one of the Looney Tunes collections where you find it. It's rare for an archive disc to have an issue like that, so that's why I found it interesting that it happened with both Jekyll and Hyde and Mark of the Vampire at the same time. So I guess just something got goofed up when these two were made, and thankfully it doesn't affect anything else, because everything else is absolutely fantastic. I will also mention, though, something I've noticed over the years that I was reminded of revisiting this. For those with really sensitive ears or sensitive hearing, if you're sensitive to noise or electronic whine or things, in the Greg Mank track, unfortunately, it's one of those commentaries that when it was recorded, there is a very high-pitched whine in one of the channels that runs through the entirety of the track. It was that way on DVD, and I know I have more sensitive ears than most, so it really is one of those that I have to turn down when I play it, because I hear this annoying whine through it. Again, most people probably won't be as able to notice it, but it's one of those commentaries where if you have sensitive ears, you will notice there's this really annoying whine there, and it's still here on the Blu-ray because it's in the source recording. So unfortunately, that pops up every once in a while with commentaries or various featurettes and things, and it's not something you'll see talked about because, again, most people they don't notice it, or they don't have very sensitive ears, or there are all kinds of things at play. But I did notice it again this time. I had forgotten because it had been a while since I had listened to the commentary. I started listening to it again, and then all of a sudden I heard that, noticed that again. I'm like, oh man. Then I remembered when I'd watched it on DVD before having the same problem. So, and I double checked, and yeah, it was still on the DVD. So it's just one of those commentaries where if you have sensitive hearing, you might want to turn it down some, or play it on speakers on the other side of the room or something. Just don't wear headphones and listen to it. But yeah, it's just something I had forgotten about when I was revisiting this. So that's my review of Warner Archive's absolutely miraculous restoration of the 1931 Rouben Mamoulian Frederic March starring Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde from Paramount. It is one of the finest restorations of modern times. It's absolutely stunning in its quality. The fact that it is available on this beautiful Blu-ray for such a dirt cheap price means I think everybody with a Blu-ray player should own a copy of this and rewatch it every October. It is a miraculous restoration. And it ports over Greg Mank's excellent commentary and adds another excellent commentary as well. So you're getting a real wealth of additional content in the two commentaries, which make the purchase all the more important. So I would stress for anyone who has not checked out this archive release yet. It is one of their finest releases this year. It is a strong contender for Disc of the Year for the entirety of 2022. It's another of their absolutely top-tier must-own discs that really brings a classic, important, iconic title to the HD realm in a way that pretty much all of us thought would never happen, because the elements were so limited, and the previous releases were only up to a certain point of quality standard simply due to those elements. So once again, this is a title that digital technology in the restoration world has really allowed to once again look in the way that it should. And again, short of some miraculous untouched source turning up somewhere, which probably won't happen, obviously. This is far beyond anything I thought this film could ever look like again. I've seen this film many times, but never like this. And for those who have never seen this before, seeing it this way, again, even upscaled to 4K, your minds will be absolutely blown, and it will haunt your dreams for quite a while afterwards. It's a film that definitely has staying power. It has still remains the finest film version of the classic tale. It has the most power, the most potency. It still strikes audiences to this day. Hasn't really dated. It hasn't lost any of that potency. And you could still run this film in a theater today and really knock audiences' socks off. They won't expect it. No one ever does the first time. And it is for good reason that Frederic March won the Oscar in 1931. It is an absolutely riveting performance. That and all the other elements combined with Rouben Mamoulian's incredible direction, it remains the Jekyll and Hyde for the ages of cinema, and it has remained unchallenged ever since its release in 1931. So now with this Warner Archive release, you can see it in the finest quality as yet possible, and quality that no one ever expected it to ever have again. So it is an absolutely must-own disc, and one of the finest releases of the year, one of the finest releases the archive has yet done. I cannot praise this highly enough. If you haven't gotten this disc yet, and I have not convinced you, I am not doing my job, because it is an absolutely... it's a revelation of a disc. It truly is. And the only way to improve it, short of some miraculous source turning up, would be for it to get a 4K UHD upgrade if and when the archive does move into UHD land. So hopefully that does happen at some point. But this is already a staggering disc that rivals a great many UHD disc, and that is even including all of the source limitations. So they really pulled a rabbit out of the hat with this one. Were it not for Brothers Grimm and Invaders from Mars, which still hasn't quite come out yet, this would be Restoration of the Year. It is still up there neck and neck with those as Restoration of the Year because of the mammoth undertaking it was, and the results speak for themselves. This is an incredible release, and it totally blew me away. I did not expect it to be this astonishing. So those are my thoughts on the archive release of the 1931 Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. For those who have picked up this disc or have a history with this film or love this film as much as I do, please leave your comments below. I would love to hear your thoughts on this incredible archive restoration. Again, it blew my mind. I did not know that this film could be resuscitated and brought back to life in this manner. It is absolutely staggering. So my highest recommendation, please go and get a copy of this if you haven't already, because it helps show your support for incredible film restoration work, and it is so cheap that it is astonishing what they're able to do, and then turn around and sell for $20, and then frequently on sale for under $15, which is just mind-boggling. So all of that, plus the two commentaries and the radio adaptation, make it one of the best discs of the year. Please go and get a copy. You won't regret it. You'll return to it time and time again, as it is one of the great horror classics. So as always, keep supporting both studio and boutique labels by buying films on disc to help keep physical media alive, and thank you ever so much for watching.